Since the launch of Destiny 2, strikes have never really found their place in the game. Where I feel the first game nearly perfected the formula, Destiny 2 has left a lot to be desired in how players interact with the core content. What is up, you guys? This is your man Emperor Hotshot, back at it again with a new Destiny video. Today, I'm going to be breaking down the history and evolution of Vanguard and Nightfall strikes, as well as their place in the sandbox at the moment. We'll then break down how Bungie can create new incentives for players to engage with this core activity, as well as what they can do to further enhance the player experience within it. So without further ado, let's do further. Before we look towards the future of strikes, let's first take a look at their past implementation in Destiny 2. In the beta and launch for Destiny 2, strikes and Crucible had playlist-exclusive loot, which was a huge boon towards the game, as there was great stuff to strive for in both loot pools. The Curtain Call rocket launcher was a powerhouse against Emperor Callus in the Leviathan raid, and weapons like the Nightshade Pulse Rifle and Origin Story Auto Rifle were workhorse primaries in the first year of Destiny 2. However, there was a major problem with this system. Every weapon in the game had a fixed role. This may have been a boon to Bungie when designing and balancing weapons for PvP or PvE encounters, but it seriously damaged the loot incentive in the game as a whole. There was no need to grind activities for unique loot, as once you got a weapon to drop once, it was the same every other time it dropped. Future expansions, such as Curse of Osiris and Warmind, attempted to put band-aids over this problem by injecting little bits of loot into the playlist like the Service Revolver hand cannon, but this ultimately did little to help the problem. Even with the addition of strike-specific loot like the Duty-Bound Auto Rifle and BFA hand cannon, which were potent weapons of their time, overall loot incentive just did not exist. This was only amplified by the fact that these unique weapons only had a small chance to drop as rewards from Nightfall strikes. That was until Forsaken came around. Forsaken was a big expansion in its own right, comparable by many to the legendary Taken King expansion of Destiny 1. This total overhaul of the game was only elevated further by the reintroduction of random rolls to loot. Now guns like the Nameless Midnight Scout could run with Triple Tap and Rampage, even if Explosive Payload was still a top-tier perk option. The mere fact that most of these weapons in the game now had extra variation each time they dropped made the pursuit of loot all the more engaging. No longer were duplicates an auto-dismantle on drop, but players were incentivized to at least check a gun's perks or test the feeling out of a weapon out on a poor drag in the EDZ. While Curse of Osiris may have been the first DLC to reintroduce strike-specific loot into Destiny 2, Forsaken was the first expansion to add weapons that were coveted from these strikes. Mindbender's Ambition, for example, was a highly sought-after shotgun that dropped from the Hallowed Lair strike and dominated the Crucible for years. The Horror's Least Pulse Rifle from the Corrupted Strike was also a very solid rapid-fire frame pulse rifle in its time, as it was the only one of its kind, just as the Malicious Birthright from the Lake of Shadows was the only kinetic grenade launcher. However, just like throughout Year 1, these weapons would only drop from the Nightfall versions of each strike, meaning there was a limited window to grind these weapons based on the rotation each week of the Nightfalls. Strikes have largely been left unchanged in Destiny 2 since Forsaken, outside of the reorganization of the strike playlists. As such, they have largely felt like chores to the average player for the weekly Powerful and Pinnacle rewards. Not to mention that, as it stands now, strike-specific rewards are non-existent in the current sandbox. While yes, okay, older Forsaken-era content can still drop, those weapons have since been sunset and cannot be infused above the 1100 light limit imposed by Beyond Light. Although, to be fair, seasons of Chosen and Splicer have both added quite a few weapons to grind for, such as the new Nightfall exclusive reprisals of Shadow Price and Palindrome, and the new playlist exclusive rocket launcher and pulse rifle. But before these changes, all Year 4 strike loot was relegated to the Universal World loot pool, meaning grinding strikes had no better rewards than playing the Crucible, Gambit, or even going out on patrol. Guardians have also become significantly more powerful than ever thanks to the customization allotted by Armor 2.0 and the introduction of combat style mods such as Charged with Light and Warmind cells. As such, a lot of lower level content feels too easy for the average player, and most strikes have devolved into speedrunning to knock out weekly grinds. It's no wonder why the reprised Devil's Lair strike had once again become a fan favorite because of the way it shakes up the formula. A lot of enemies are thrown at the player throughout the strike, and the way the arenas are set up, especially with the spider tank portion, really engages with the player and forces them to think about their positioning in relation to the boss and countless ads defending them. Ever since Destiny 2 went free to play, Bungie has not been able to monetize the core playlists as they are free for all players to engage with. As such, it feels like Bungie has shifted focus away from supporting these core game modes. This ultimately feels like the wrong move to make, as these playlists are the lifeblood of the game once a player finishes story and raid content packaged in the DLC and seasons. And now that the seasonal progression systems, such as the Hammer of Proving and Splicer Gauntlet, rely on players engaging with these core playlists as a fuel or focusing source, the need for players to enter these activities on a regular basis has only skyrocketed. As such, I feel like the strike should occupy a similar space as that of dungeons in other games, a place where players go and engage with not only to level, but to obtain unique loot and seek challenges at higher level veteran content. One thing that I really miss from Destiny 1 was the concept of killing an enemy and, quote, wearing their ass as a hat. While this quote from Luke Smith may have been in regards to Oryx in the Taken King Vidoc, it was an ideology that was heavily prevalent in the strike-exclusive rewards of that era in Destiny, providing a chance at unique boss-themed gear upon completing a strike. Did you defeat the Scion Flayers of the Dust Palace on Mars? Well, players had a chance to get the Treads Upon Stars Scout Rifle or the legendary Hunter Scion Flayer mantles. Did you defeat the heavily modified Shank Saber 1? Well, how about a new machine gun in the form of Baron's Ambition, or the Devouring Maw helmet for Warlocks? Did you conquer the Shield Brothers of Valis Malal and Valis Talurn? Well, Titans had a chance at the unique Malal's Maulers. While some of these rewards were dependent on completing specific challenges in these strikes, the mere fact that they could drop had people running strikes endlessly. These also significantly shook up the fashion game for Guardians, which, as we all know, is Destiny's endgame. Going into the future, Bungie should place a greater emphasis on the reintroduction of strike-specific loot into the game. This wouldn't even necessarily require Bungie to create new gear, as the easiest thing for them to do would be to reprise Year 2 Nightfall exclusive rewards with updated random rolls and re-implement them back into their appropriate strikes. Mindbender's Ambition could begin to drop with perks like Opening Shot, Trench Barrel, or perhaps even 1-2 Punch. Horror's Lease could once again be contender for Best Rapid-Fire Pulse Rifle against the likes of Time-Worn Spire and the new Grid Skipper. Warden's Law, a very unique hand cannon from the Warden of Nothing strike, may even find its own niche in PvE or PvP with the right perk pool. Year 1 Nightfall weapons could also be reprised with random rolls in the future if those strikes they are tied to ever re-emerge from the Destiny content vault. Alternatively, as fellow Destiny content creator Kujay explains in his video on the matter, Bungie could also tie the Year 1 Nightfall weapons to new or existing strikes in the game. This would of course be step 1 of creating new loot incentives within strikes. Step 2 would come from reprising some old loot rewards from Destiny 1 and adding them to appropriate strikes. A weapon like the Grasp of Moloch Pulse Rifle would still be a fitting reward for the Disgraced and could once again become a top tier weapon pick in the Crucible. The Treads Upon Star Scout Rifle from the Cabal themed strikes in D1 would fit right in as a reward on strikes like the Inside Terminus or the Arms Dealer. Fallen-themed weapons like the Baron's Ambition machine gun, or the Devil's Dawn sniper rifle, and the Does Not Bow auto rifle could be great rewards once again for Exodus Crash, Fallen Saber, and the Devil's Lair strikes. The Imago Loop was a personal favorite hand cannon, and one that I would love to see return to Vex-themed strikes like the Glassway or the Inverted Spire. Hell, Warlocks even have a few unique armor rewards that could be reprised, but we'll save this for step 3. While Warlocks have it easy with potential armor rewards such as the Devouring Maw helmet or the Omnighoul Warlock bond, most of the other armor rewards for Titans and Hunters really wouldn't fit in the strikes we currently have in the game. As such, step 3 would be the most difficult, as this requires Bungie to make brand new themed rewards for the strikes in the game. For example, what if we created a new helmet for Titans based on the boss from the arms dealer called the Helm of Brakazan? How about a new hive-themed hunter cloak called the Cloak of the Brood Queen that looks as though we took part of the dress of the Brood Queen Anaya and draped it over our shoulders? We could even go as far as to create weapons that fit thematically with certain bosses, like an arc heavy machine gun based off Protheon's arm cannon. Even adding simple armor or weapon ornaments to be used alongside armor synthesis would be a great way to breathe new life into the Stagnant Strike playlists. What truly matters is channeling that basic human instinct a considerable portion of the player base has to not only be the best, but look the best while doing it. Now that we have some rewards in place for players to earn in specific strikes, it would be a shame for players to be unable to get them. While some members of the community like Kuj would propose the reintroduction of the skeleton key and chest system here, I'd like to propose an alternative. The exclusive rewards should have a chance to drop from the boss itself at the end of a strike, much like the rewards of Escalation Protocol back in Warmind. This keeps the reward as an added bonus outside of the plethora of other rares and the occasional legendary that drops at the end of a strike chest. This would also ensure that these rewards are not paired to the Nightfall strikes exclusively, as we've seen in the past, if that's a path Bungie would want to take. Bungie can of course weigh this loot to be more common in Nightfalls, but ideally we want to ensure that this gear can be obtained by any player just by playing the game. This new system also creates a number of long-term goals for players to grind for. I firmly believe that keeping this ideology of strike exclusive rewards going forward is integral to the health of Destiny as a whole. Despite what Bungie may label the game as, Destiny will always at its heart be a looter-shooter. While Bungie has undoubtedly gotten that shooter part down to a science, they have often left a lot to be desired when it comes to the loot aspect of the game. The aforementioned strike exclusive rewards are what I like to call Phase 1 of solving this issue. Phase 2 involves revitalizing the loot players can receive in the strike playlist as a whole. While I've long advocated for a total vendor refresh to the core activities on a yearly basis, and still do, I do sympathize with Bungie's current predicament and how that may not be as realistic as it once was under the banner of Activision. As such, the best alternative to a total vendor refresh would be a steady drip feeding of new weapons to strive for within the current core activities like Strikes, Crucible, and Gambit. Luckily for us, Bungie already seems to be taking the first steps in this direction. Before Beyond Light in late 2020, all activity rewards were relegated to the basic Universal World loot pool, which greatly diminished the drive players had to engage with activities they didn't particularly enjoy. Players had no more incentive to grind strikes than they did to go out on patrol or pray to RNGesus at Banshee 44. As of Season of the Chosen, however, Bungie has added 2 unique weapons to each of the 3 core activities. The Vanguard having been graced with the Royal Entry rocket launcher and the 3rd Axiom pulse rifle, the former of which being a fairly desirable weapon with the right perk rolls. While these additions may seem small on paper, if Bungie keeps this momentum adding 2 or 3 weapons to each playlist every season, that starts to add up over time to being equal of that of a vendor refresh. These new weapons also help to not only drive up player engagement with the core activities, but also add more gear for players to obtain and strive for. After all, before Bottom Dollar was introduced, how often were you willingly jumping into Gambit? Outside of these seasonal playlist weapons, I would also like to see new armor sets for these activities as well. While we technically got new armor with Beyond Light, it's a reskin between all 3 activities. Despite the Taken King having done something very similar to Vanguard and Crucible armor, those weapons at least had small mesh tweaks here and there to better fit the themes of the activity, such as adding or removing feathers and other kibble, rather than simply slapping a few different decals on the same armor. Bungie could similarly accomplish the same goal by reprising armor currently in the game, or by reusing that which we already have in the Destiny content vault. Again, this is really in service of adding yet another breath of fresh air to the core activities like Strikes. While we've already established a substantial number of new loot incentives that we can add to the game, we can go even further by creating a better reward structure that further incentivizes players to keep engaging with the playlist. This can be done any number of ways, one of the primary examples of which being implementing a passive buff that slowly increases the number or quality of loot rewards, or even additional planetary materials for players the longer they stay in the playlist. A similar system was present in the first Destiny and increased the likelihood of a player getting desired rewards from the end of a strike, including the aforementioned strike-specific rewards. Another way to add more incentive is to reintroduce strike scoring. While it may be present in Destiny 2 Nightfall, strike scoring was present in every strike playlist in the original game, adding a more arcadey feel to those playlists. It triggers something in the monkey brains of most players when they see numbers go up and get bigger on screen, leading them to want to try and get that number as high as it can go. And while there may be some debate in the community as to whether or not a higher score directly led to better quality loot at the end of the strike, I certainly think it's something Bungie can look at to make players actually engage with strikes a bit more regularly. Another option open to Bungie in order to shake up strike playlists is introducing more unique modifiers to the game. In Destiny 2 at present, there are only about 6 or so modifiers to the general strike playlist, not including the weekly elemental singes. And while the Nightfalls may have exclusive modifiers that affect specific enemies or encounters within those strikes, these modifiers are unavailable to the core strike playlists. What's more, there were, at one time or another, a set of more unique mission modifiers in Destiny 2 in the form of Mercury Heroic Adventures from the Curse of Osiris expansion. Take for example Elite Soldier, where power and kinetic weapons deal more damage as well as reload faster at the cost of your super recharging slower. What about From the Shadows, where running and crouch speeds are increased, melees recharge faster and deal more damage at the cost of your grenade recharging much more slowly. Even Risk and Reward has some interesting applications thanks to the increased ability damage at the cost of slower recharge times. These modifiers could even perhaps be used in future events like Guardian games or Solstice of Heroes that have a large focus on PvE activities and help to, once again, say it with me now, shake up the strike playlists. Taking this a step further, Bungie also has the option of looking back at Destiny 1 for inspiration of new modifiers to be added to Destiny 2. The Elemental Burns, Daybreak, as well as Small Arms and Specialists would be great ways for Bungie to encourage players to try out more of the countless weapons being added every season, or experiment with new and exciting builds. In addition to the changes we've gone through earlier in this video, I'd like to propose the reintroduction of heroic level strikes, that not only bridge the gap between standard and Nightfall strikes, but offer a form of challenge to free-to-play players. As opposed to the elemental singes we see in the standard strike playlists, heroics would have the opportunity to reintroduce elemental burns of Destiny 1, wherein specific elements each week deal 3 times more damage from related sources than the 25% increase to damage of the respective singe. Heroics would also differ in that more majors are seen throughout the strikes, resulting in tougher enemies and encounters, while still being accessible to newer or less skilled players. As such, this increase in difficulty would directly correlate to better loot, perhaps replacing some of the common rares at the end of strikes with more legendaries, or allowing more chances for rarer strike loot such as exclusives. With the reintroduction of the Heroic Strike playlist, we could also see the return of the Skeleton Key system from Destiny 1. In this new iteration of Skeleton Keys, they would function similarly to that of corrupted key codes in Season of the Splicer. For the uninformed, corrupted key codes are a rare item that has a chance to drop from enemies in almost any activity. This could then be used to unlock corrupted chests in the expunge missions for high-quality loot. Skeleton keys would be legendary items with a cap similar to that of corrupted key codes. The skeleton chest itself would be another chest that spawns at the end of a heroic or nightfall strike, and can be used to unlock additional rewards with the skeleton key, for a chance at high stat rolled armor, weapons, or exclusive gear in that particular strike. We could also give the option that weapons dropped from skeleton chests would be able to roll with an additional perk in the 3rd or 4th column. This helps create a feedback loop of players going into heroic playlists to spend the keys they've accumulated, as well as give another avenue for free-to-play players to get some decent gear. As some of you may notice, however, these reprised heroic strikes sound a lot like Adept level Nightfalls, and you would be right, this is by design. With these new changes and additions to create heroic strike difficulty, we'd have to make Adept Nightfalls stand apart from heroic strikes. As such, I would like to propose the introduction of just 1 or 2 barrier champions to Adept level Nightfalls. This would not only act as a great way to introduce champions to lower skilled players, but as well as be an avenue to teach players on how to deal with champions via anti-champion mods. This even has the benefit of still giving players an avenue to access relatively easy Nightfall exclusive rewards such as Hungry Palindrome or whatever else may be added in the future. On a side note, I really hope Bungie starts creating new weapon rewards for Nightfall the Ordeal as opposed to relying solely on hype generated by old favorites returning from the original Destiny. As I alluded to earlier, the Devil's Lair and new Battleground activity were highly praised during the Season of the Chosen by the community. Well, why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons to point out here. The biggest factor between both is the idea of enemy density. The Devil's Lair strike has well over 300 enemies packed wall to wall within that strike. This not only helps combat feel intense, it also lets the player feel more powerful as they wash through hordes of rank and file enemies in a combat arena. There is also less travel time in these activities. Outside of a few notable parts in the Nessus and Europa battlegrounds, you spend little time traveling to the next arena as Bungie wants you to get into that combat rhythm again as soon as possible. Devil's Lair goes even further and has all 3 combat encounters and 3 tightly knit arenas to keep the combat rhythm on beat. The opposite is true for many of the strikes in the game now. A lot of Destiny 2 strikes have somewhere between 150 to 200 enemies total, with large travel sections padding out time in these activities, which really is a shame because strikes like the Scarlet Keep and Exodus Crash have some pretty fun encounters and set pieces. But what if we upped the number of enemies on the drawbridge or the area just before the elevator on the Scarlet Keep? You and your fire team now have to act more like a lance and push through a horde of hive that want nothing more than to keep you out and consume your light. Imagine the part with the Fallen Walker on Exodus Crash, where Fallen were continuously being flown in on dropships with sniper vandals lining the high elevation points. Suddenly you have to fight an uphill battle against a spider tank and an army of Fallen. Guardians want nothing more than to use and showcase their power, so let them. Another great thing that both Battlegrounds and the Devil's Lair do is add the health of the boss to a UI element on the bottom of the screen. Raids and dungeons have done this for quite some time, since at least Forsaken, but it's a nice quality of life feature that really helps with the readability of a boss's health without having to peek out of cover at the boss like any other enemy. While some may argue it's not necessary since most bosses can be melted in a matter of seconds anyway, it would add a level of uniformity between PvE activities and boss encounters. It would also have a knock-on effect of making it easier for players to see when a boss's immunity phase may activate in a strike like the Disgraced or the Fanatic, and prevent players from wasting a super. This would even allow for players in higher level Nightfalls a better read on a situation without having to pop out of cover and look at the boss directly. Even tweaking the boss health bar UI a bit to allow for multiple bosses to have their health depicted on the screen at the same time could come in handy not for just, say, a strike like the Glassway, but for future strikes or PvE content that may be implemented. While we're on the topic of bosses, I implore Bungie to stop relying on health gating as a means to prevent bosses from immediately being burned. Burning a boss should always be a high skill technique that requires some modicum of teamwork and communication to stack buffs and deal damage as efficiently as possible. If it is that much of a problem, buff the health of bosses across the board. It doesn't feel good as a player to always be locked out of boss damage after hitting a certain threshold, and I know Bungie can be a lot more creative with boss designs and mechanics than they have been in recent times. Quaria in Season of the Splicer is the best and most recent example of this. In summary, strikes aren't in a good place at the moment. The drive for players to actually engage with these activities outside of weekly grinds or Nightfall exclusive rewards just isn't there at the moment. In the short term, Bungie can reissue old Nightfall Strike exclusive gear from Year 1 and Year 2 of Destiny 2, as well as activate strike scoring in the base strike playlist. Bungie can also take some time to look at the Mercury Heroic Adventure modifiers and try to implement them back into standard strikes to have a wider and more interesting pool of modifiers for the playlist to rotate through day to day or week to week. In the long term, Bungie can create a new reward structure as well as modify existing ones to create long-term pursuits in the strike playlist by creating more cosmetic and practical rewards for players to use, such as armor pieces, weapons, or even ornaments. The reintroduction of the Heroic Strike playlist would enable free-to-play players to have a more difficult PvE experience than they can find in the game at current, and would allow Bungie to reintroduce the skeleton key system from D1. Bungie can also revamp encounters in some of the strikes already in the game to better take advantage of new hardware and adhere to principles like enemy density. But that's all for me in this video. Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments section below. Do you agree with some of these ideas? What would you change to improve strikes? I'll have follow-up videos coming soonish talking about Gambit as well as Crucible changes, so stay tuned for those. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you want. Until next time, this is your man Emperor Hotshot, signing off.